As people come in now, I'm just admitting everyone. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome everyone. I'm just admitting everyone. So once we've got everyone in, we will start the session in the next couple of minutes or so. Just waiting for everyone. I can see Sheikh Husseini from Malaysia. I can see you there, looking wonderful as usual. We've got people, we've got around 30 coming up, 40 people or so. So people from far as from America all the way to Malaysia, Indonesia, and a lot of folks locally in the UK and Europe as well. Just a couple of minutes, just waiting for everyone to come through. Okay, so as you come in, as you join, participants, if you just could put all your Zoom on mute, if you don't mind, you can put it on mute. It'll just help. If there's any noise, or background noise, or anything like that, I'm just going to admit as people come in. Okay, we've got a few more people. Admit. Still coming through. I can see some familiar faces. Imran Chowdhury. Nice to see you. I was saying to Jonathan, you know, Professor Jonathan, his weather is lovely. We've got lovely weather in the UK, in London and in DC. Okay. What's the weather like in Malaysia at the moment? Must be sunny and nice as well. You say, yeah? Okay, right. I think that's everyone. We're still accepting. Okay, I'm going to accept more people as they come along, but we're going to make a prompt start. Anyway, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome, brothers and sisters. Thank you so much. This is the next session on our Zoom conferencing session titled Justice and Islamic Law. We're very privileged to have Dr. Ibrahim Ramon Harvey and Professor Jonathan Brown from Georgetown University from the US of A joining us. Okay, so what's going to happen? The format is we're going to have, first of all, presentation by Dr. Ramon for about 10 minutes or so, and then we're going to have Professor Jonathan, who's also going to present on his forthcoming book as well for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to have a conversation between both Dr. Ramon and Professor Jonathan, and then after that we'll open up for questions and answers. Now questions, if you don't mind, brothers and sisters, if you can put it on the chat, just makes it easy, and both Professor and Dr. Ramon can choose which questions they want to answer. So this is being recorded, so we will send you a link if you did miss any sessions or so, any part. And if you want to forward the link to your friends and family, please do so we can have more participants. So just a reminder to everyone, can you please kindly put your mics on mute. I should be able to put it on mute anyway. You can have your faces if you want to show your faces, that's not a problem. But please kindly put your mics on mute. Right, so I'm going to start with our first guest. We have Dr. Ramon Harvey, who is the Aziz Foundation Lecturer in Islamic Studies at Ebrahim College and visiting lecturer at Cambridge Muslim College, where he teaches reviewing foundations at the BA in Islamic Studies. He's a graduate of SOAS, and it focuses on Quranic studies, philosophy, theology, ethics. His book, which we're going to go through, The Quran and the Just Society, was just recently published by Edinburgh University Press in 2018, and currently writing a second monograph for EUP as well on constructive Muslim theology. If you want to know more about his book, please don't hesitate to contact him, or you can just Google Edinburgh University Press and you should be able to see Quran and the Just Society. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Ramon. Bismillah ar-Rahman.
Bismillah. Can everyone hear me okay? Is my volume okay? Alhamdulillah, okay. So alhamdulillah, I've been told to summarize some things about my book, The Quran and the Just Society, in about 10 minutes to kick things off. There it is. This, as some of you may know, came out of my PhD project at SOAS. and it was supervised by Professor Abdul Halim at the time. And then I developed it and revised it for the actual book. The main kind of vision behind it was a recognition that there is or was no real book, it seemed to me, that dealt with the kind of idea of justice in the Quran in a kind of comprehensive way. And so I wanted to find a way to sort of address that area in the field and put that out there. One of the main thinkers that was, I think, influential in the book was Fazl Rahman. In his work, obviously, emphasized justice a lot. And he talked about finding a kind of system of ethics from the Quran as a way to address kind of ethical problems in the present, or you know, the issues of trying to reform society. So he's obviously coming from a modernist stance, and I think I sort of self-consciously sort of sat within that stance to some extent, but with some provisos. And one of them was that I didn't want to try to make a kind of comprehensive solution or you know, reform effort per se, but just to study in his two-stage, you know, he's got his two-stage movement theory where you look back at the period of revelation and then you look to the present. I restricted myself just to the first stage, just to try to articulate this idea of the just society in the time of revelation, in the time of the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad SAW and the early community around him. And so I kind of knew that there's the second stage is left hanging, and I think everyone recognizes how hard that second stage is, but I felt that it was still worthwhile just to try to properly look at the question of justice and the principles of justice in the Quran, something that Fazl Rahman talked about but didn't comprehensively achieve himself. So I tried to develop a methodology for that, to sort of systematically look through the areas of social justice in the Quran. Another figure who was important at that stage was Muhammad Abdullah Draz. In his book, The Moral World of the Quran, he, you know, I noticed he has a lot of discussion of meta-ethics, but then really, when it comes to the social ethics, he just has sort of a list. And I felt that this could be developed and it would be a useful contribution. So I went through, I used various methods of hermeneutics in the book, you know, different things that were important really in contemporary and, you know, modern tafsir. Things like looking at the structure of passages. You know, this is the Nizam approach, you know, as used by Farahi and Islahi, and becoming increasingly popular in contemporary academic studies as well. Looking at questions of linguistics and, you know, textual elements from the Balagha tradition as well. Intratextual analysis, looking at the different verses as they interact. And these are all familiar things broadly within tafsir or within contemporary tafsir, but trying to bring them together for a particular goal, which was to extract ethical principles from the Quran. And so I went through in this way. I came up with these several spheres of justice, a political sphere of justice, a distributive sphere, and a corrective sphere. So the political justice included things like governance issues. I mean, there's not that many ahkam or rulings about that in the Quran, but there are important elements from the stories of previous prophets and their communities, I argue, and looking at questions of war and peace, and also you know, conflict resolution and so on. And then in the distributive, this was, you know, really connected with the idea of regulating different roles, responsibilities of society. So we have in there issues of arms, you know, charity, you could say, trade, questions of marriage and inheritance and so on. And then, of course, you have corrective justice, looking at, I divided it into public and private crimes. I don't have time, obviously, today in a few minutes to go through all the details of that, but I'm trying to give you the idea that there's a kind of attempt to give a kind of blueprint for what were the principles of the just society in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, based on what the Quran says, trying to extract, we could call that the hikam, the wisdoms underlying rules, and also as well as independent principles of of justice in there, and to try to map them together. So in any one area, other scholars, other individuals may have gone in deeper into these subjects, and I draw on that work as well. But overall, it was the attempt to try to trace it together and make a pattern that would be useful for people to reflect on these elements and to see how this could be beneficial for Islamic ethical discourse today. I also have some discussion on kind of meta ethics, kind of the fundamental grounding of ethics, and some of those more theological and sort of deeper questions in there, which hopefully is useful in the early part of the book. The overall intention really is to make a book that was accessible to the reader, the interested reader, also useful for scholars and those doing research. The book's not perfect already. It's come out a couple of years ago. It represented, more than 10 years ago, I started that body of work, and already I can see things where maybe I would do it differently. But I think that it's out there, and it's hopefully can be the foundation for other works that build on this area. I think one of the things that I was trying to solve in the book is, how to make use of the tradition and the tafsir and the various genres and disciplines of Islamic thought in a way that the book is grounded in those discourses, but also takes account of contemporary thought and even the context of academic thought in the world of Quranic studies, which I'm working within. So it's really trying to make a kind of balancing act between those elements, between the tradition and sort of the contemporary world, and in order to express these wisdoms. Now, what to do with that, could be something that could be part of the discussion going forward. I don't think it's a simple case that you have this book and you can somehow go and radically use it to change all of Islamic law. I think that any sort of process is much more complex than that, much more nuanced, and in fact that obviously I wouldn't claim that I've got all the answers anyway. But hopefully, if there is some benefit in extracting these things and reflecting on some of the underlying rationales of the law and wisdom of justice, then hopefully it can, be part of that conversation in whatever the community and the intellectual community as a whole decides to kind of do going forward. So that was the main thing I wanted to say in a short period of time. Perhaps we could build on these points in the discussions, any questions and conversations. So I think I'll leave it there for now and look for the further feedback of the group.
Thank you, Ramon. Thank you. Appreciate that. Those who are just joining us now, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome. You might have missed Dr. Ramon Harvey's presentation. Apologize, but if you have, don't worry. We are recording this, so you have a chance to look at his presentation. We'll send you the link after this, after we've recorded it in due course, and you can have a look. Those who have joined in, please, and those who are already in there, please keep your Zoom links on mute. We will be taking questions after the presentation. We're going to have Professor Jonathan Brown very shortly, who's going to present on his forthcoming book and related to justice in Islam. Just to remind everyone, please, I can see some folks, you can hear some background noise. If you don't mind, please put your Zoom links on mute so we can hear the actual the professors make their presentation clearly without any interruptions. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Professor Jonathan Brown, who is the Al-Walid bin Talal Chair of Islamic Civilization at Georgetown University, which received his bachelor's from Georgetown in 2000, and he completed his doctorate at the University of Chicago. He's studied abroad in many countries, in Syria, Turkey, Morocco, Yemen, and we've seen some of his publications such as the canonization of Bukhari Muslim, Hadith, function of Sunni Hadith canon, Hadith, Muhammad's legacy in the medieval world, and recently misquoting Muhammad, challenges and choices of interpreting its legacy to one world 2040. And he's got some forthcoming, and he's a recent book on slavery in Islam. So he's also the director of research at the April Institute. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Professor Jonathan. Really privileged and honoured that you have taken up time to come and present to our audience. Welcome. Assalamualaikum, Professor. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. You guys hear me?
Yep, we hear you perfectly.
Okay.
So you've got about 10 minutes, so I'm going to hand it over to you now, inshallah.
Okay, assalamu alaikum, everybody. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I'm always happy to do something with Mizan. Mizan, we just built, my kids and I just built the Lego Big Ben set. And I showed them pictures of me in Parliament and Big Ben when you arranged my talk there all those years ago. So just recalling you fondly with them. It's wonderful to see Dr. Harvey, and I enjoyed reading his book, and I learned a lot from it. And I'm glad to have him present here because I think you're probably more of a authority on this subject. So basically, the question I had, and this is a book that was about 90% written, and then after I kind of got put on the back burner because I had to write this book on slavery, but it's sort of been sitting there for a while, and now I can finish it up. And it's kind of a pretty basic question I think a lot of Muslims have, and I wanted to try and answer it, or at least for myself and for anyone else who would find usefulness in it, is what do you do when you feel like kind of the Islamic law or fiqh or Sharia or whatever we want to call it, right, is unjust? So how do we deal with like this dissonance, moments of dissonance or instances of dissonance or divergence between our sense of justice and the Islamic law as it's presented to us? And I want to kind of think about how Muslims theorize this, how Muslims deal with it institutionally, and kind of look into the Islamic tradition for answers and for wisdom on this topic. And so, oh, by the way, the reason I'm outside isn't because I'm trying to do some weird like bucolic back to nature thing. It's because inside the house is complete chaos, and this is the only place that I could be any quiet. Okay, so the question of just what do we do when Islamic law seems unjust is it's a hard question to answer, because it's actually a hard question to ask, right? So if you, in theory, right, think about this, right? I mean, if you have like, American law or something, you can say, well, this law seems unjust, so Congress should pass another law. But what do you do when your legal system, you believe that it originates in revelation, and substantial portions of its actual substance are derived directly from revealed scripture, and then the kind of rest of that legal edifice is constructed by jurists and a tradition that you believe is also in one form or the other kind of guided by God through history? And so how do you explain how it can produce unjust results or unjust rulings? And we all know instances of this, whether it's inheritance or dress or all the different things that Muslims are asked about to answer and feel insecurities about in the world today. So I mean, how do you even explain how you feel something is unjust? Because shouldn't you automatically kind of just surrender to whatever the revelation is on that issue? And so we I think we have to at just the very beginning of this question acknowledge that God, human beings are guided to God both through prophecy, but also through their own reason. And a great example of this is Sayyidina Ebrahim, when he becomes a monotheist by observing the world around him and the heavens, and his also innate understanding of what God is, what God has to be. God can't be something that disappears. So we all are sort of creatures who both are guided by our own sense of internal sense of almost intuitive sense of justice and intuitive sense of truth, and also we're guided by that to revelation. So we know that also that that God gives us rules, but also that God creates licenses or exceptions for those rules, even in the Quran itself. So the notion that you can you don't have to travel while you're fast while you're traveling, or that you are allowed to eat things that are prohibited if you're starving. If God's rules were absolutely just without exception, then you wouldn't have these exemptions created for purposes of mercy and ease. So there's this understanding that even the rules of God are general, and that sometimes there's exceptions created to tailor those rules to justice in specific situations. And we see that continued in the rulings of the Prophet, for example, when he gives the rukhsa of bay al-araya, or normally you can't buy and sell things that don't exist yet, but he allows, allows Muslims to, if they're farmers, to, sell crops that are, or fruit that's still on the trees, in addition, able to get money so that the farmer can live before, have money to spend before the crop comes in. Or the instance in which the Prophet in Sahih Bukhari gives license to Abdurrahman ibn Auf to wear silk under his clothing against a part of his body where there's like a skin infection or an itch, as a kind of smooth thing that's not going to cause him pain. We see this trend continued with Muslim scholars and jurists as they develop the laws of their madhabs, and they come up with principles in those madhabs, but they also create exceptions to those rules as well. So, for example, in the Shafi school, that you normally would not be allowed to see the face of like of course, this is medieval period when social norms are very different from ours today, but you shouldn't look at the face of a woman who's not related to you, but that there's an exemption created for like teachers. So if you're teaching the Quran to somebody, that you can look at them in the face. And so another really important point here is to understand that the functioning of Muslim courts, and this goes all the way back to the time of the Prophet, is that the organs of Muslim justice or of Islamic law, the courts and the judge, right? They actually have, they are designed to err on the side of caution. So they're on the side of people not being punished if they're innocent, and not being made liable for things if they're innocent, right? So anybody who wants to make a claim or bring a complaint against somebody else, or say that somebody else committed a crime or wronged them, it's the obligation of the person making that claim to provide evidence. So the burden of proof is on the person making the claim. And I know that seems obvious. Oh, how could that be anything other than that? But in fact, there's lots of legal traditions in the world, including Germanic and Anglo-Saxon legal traditions prior to the 1100s, where actually the burden of proof was on the defendant. So if somebody came out to you and said, you did this thing, you stole this thing, or you hit this person, injured them, it was the burden of proof was on the accused person to prove they were innocent. So there's lots of aspects of Islamic law that go back even to the hadiths of the Prophet talking about judges, where it's clear that the Muslim court is erring on the side of caution, and erring on the side of preferring that an innocent person go free, that a guilty person then go free, than that an innocent person be wrongly convicted. And a great example of this, a hadith you see in Sahih Bukhari, and also there's other versions of it, like in Sunan of Abu Dawood, where the Prophet says, "Innama ana basharun," right? And I'm just a person. وَإِنَّكُمْ لَتَخْتَصِمُونَ إِلَيَّ, you two come to me, and you are giving me, you're disputing a case before me, and it may be that one of you is better at presenting his evidence. Alhan bi hujjatihi, he's more eloquent in presenting his evidence, even though he's actually not telling the truth. And I might rule based on the evidence that's brought before me, and I might rule that one of the person who's innocent is, I might find them guilty, or I might because that's what the evidence suggests. And that if you do that, if you trick the judge, then you're going to be punished on the day of judgment. But the idea here is that there's this reliance on the afterlife. So if a judge makes a mistake, it's better for the judge to make a mistake on the side of mercy, because that person who's guilty is going to be punished in the afterlife, than to make a mistake on the side of severity and punish an innocent person unjustly. right? So this is a very important point. Now, what that means is, I don't know how much more time I have, Mizan. I can't remember, like no time. Okay, well, I'll just.
You've got maximum about a couple of more minutes. Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. That's enough time then. So then the question is, how do Muslim scholars deal with instances in which a Muslim court or the kind of application of Islamic law seems to present instances of injustice? And actually, you can imagine that this is quite possible with this Islamic system, because let's say I'm somebody who has, one of my relatives was killed, and I bring this case to the court, and I'm unable to provide enough evidence that that so-and-so murdered my relative, right? The way that Islamic law works, and this is intended by God and the Prophet, is to make it, I have to find evidence. Like, I can't just come and say something and people believe me, right? I have to find evidence, whether it's witnesses or strong circumstantial evidence that this person killed my relative. I can't just come and make a claim and have this potentially innocent person punished. So if I can't find that evidence, then I have not been given my justice. I have not been given my haqq. But that's designed to be that way because it's designed to prevent instances of an innocent person being punished unfairly. So what Muslims scholars said is, well, so how do we deal with this, right? So one option is you just say, look, you kind of just say this is the revealed law of God, and we trust in the afterlife. So this actually happens in one case with the Caliph Umar bin Aziz, and a man is unable to bring evidence to convict the murderer or the alleged murderer of one of his relatives. And Umar bin Aziz just says, look, I'm sorry, but we can't do anything in this world, but in the afterlife, the murderer will be punished. So justice will become in the afterlife. The other response is a much more like functionalist response, right? Which would be to say, the job of a Muslim court is always to give justice. And if that means that the judge has to be much more flexible, or that the rules of evidence that we normally use have to be much more flexible, then that's what you have to do, right? So this would be more the approach of Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah in his famous book, Turuq al-Hukmiyah, where he basically argues that, Islamic law or Sharia is justice. And if you don't give justice, then you're really not doing the Sharia. The problem with that approach is, it's great in theory, but we just talked about, it's not like God and the Prophet put these rules restricting judges there to make people's lives difficult, right? Or to make mistakes. They put these laws there because they wanted to protect people who might be falsely accused, right? And what that meant is that, yes, every once in a while, a guilty person was going to go free, but that was going to be compensated for by the fact that you were protecting against the abuse of innocent people. The third approach was to say, let's create institutions where we can basically deal with appeals issues, right? And this is what my book is about. It's about these courts called madhalim courts, or some is pronounced mazalim courts, which are basically courts. It's called courts of grievances. And this is what you would do is if you were unhappy with the ruling that you received in the regular Qadi court, you would go to the madhalim court, which was held under the rubric of the ruler. And it usually wasn't the ruler himself doing it. It was a judge, a Qadi, or a mufti, or a scholar who'd been assigned this job. But what happened is in these courts, the judge had less restrictions on what he could do. For example, he didn't just have to rule by his madhab. Let's say he's a Shafi or a Hanafi. He could mix between madhabs to get the best result. He couldn't go outside the madhabs. He couldn't do something that was prohibited by the Sharia altogether. But he could, let's say, take the Maliki madhab because it allows documentary evidence more. Or he could take the Maliki madhab because it allows the judge to rule based on what he knows in that situation, as opposed to just what's coming from the evidence. That in these courts would kind of tilt so if the regular status of a kind of condition of a Muslim court is that it's tilted like this, kind of uphill, where the person making the claim has the burden of proof and they have to kind of work uphill, and the innocent or the person being claimed against is like at the top and sort of has a downhill fight. What this would do is kind of tilt it in the other direction, where it's making it easier for the person who's making the claim to prove their case, because it's sort of relaxing the rules of evidence. So these are some of the questions that the book deals with. And just one last point I want to make is that to get in this discussion is not to impugn divine law or to impugn divine justice. It's to understand that law is by nature general, right? And so this goes all the way back to Aristotle, who makes this observation, which is that law deals with generalities, and that's important, right? So when the law says that, if you commit this crime, you're going to get this punishment, the reason that's a general rule, and it's a general rule because what it's saying is everybody's going to be treated equal. If Ibrahim commits this crime, if Mizan commits this crime, if Jonathan commits this crime, we're all going to be treated equal because we're all slaves of God and we're all human beings. And if people don't feel like the law is treating them equally, they don't respect the law, and society stops functioning. On the other hand, anytime you're dealing with general rules, there's always going to be exceptions to those general rules or particular instances that don't fit. So you can think of an instance where, let's say somebody, we can all think about these instances from like movies and TV or something, where, a guy was a criminal, but he in the movie he saves a bunch of kids and kind of redeems himself, but he's still technically a criminal. So you're like, I feel like this guy really shouldn't get punished, but the law says they should get punished, but that doesn't seem just. So there's always instances in which the generality of the law doesn't really deal with what we sense is just in that particular situation. And that's when you have to go to these what's called equity courts, or courts that deal with specific instances of justice or injustice. And that's what the Madhalim courts were in Islamic civilization. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Jonathan. Okay, right. Okay, so we have just had both our distinguished guests present their presentations. Now we're going to be opening up for questions and answers. So to make it easy, we've got nearly 70, 80 people online at the moment. I've just sent a link to Dr. Ramon's published book, so please do purchase it on the link, both Amazon and Edinburgh Press. Professor Jonathan, when's your book coming out? The next book on?
Yeah, I don't know. I have to finish it first. I'm not being super productive these days, I'll be honest with you. This year has been kind of a wash. I've gotten a lot done. I don't know what happened. And now, I spend most of my time homeschooling my kids. So I don't know, sometime.
In your time.
We'll see, inshallah.
Why not? When it's ready, we'll launch it in London again. Bismillah, Ramon, Dr. Ramon.
I had a comment about the elements of justice you mentioned about the hereafter or the afterlife elements. I was thinking today, reading some of these things, particularly in the UK, about the complete failure to protect the people, and the same things going on in the US with the coronavirus, and the mass death we're seeing because of these failures to look ahead and to do things properly. And what actually came into my mind was, if there was justice in the world, then these people wouldn't be able to stay in charge, whether it's Boris Johnson or Trump or and then I thought, wait a minute, I just wrote this book about justice. I should believe there is justice in the world. Obviously it's different, maybe in different places, but I think one of the realizations I've had in the past kind of years has just been, how hard justice is to achieve in practice. And, it is always imperfect. I mean, you could give the exception to the years of the Prophet ﷺ, when there's revelation coming down about the community's life. But, in general, study of history shows it is really difficult. And yet it's still important to have that ideal. So the value isn't always in the realization or the possible realization of justice, but to sort of have a standard to at least get it the best we can here. And I think obviously that's a good, that sort of adds to the point of why you might need a secondary court, a grievance court, a Madhalim court. because even in the regular court, there's all these problems that could happen, or lack of evidence, or the interpretation is slightly off for that situation, or whatever it is. So I thought that was a useful thing to add on to your talk.
Professor Jonathan,
I mean, I think, I mean, I think it's, it's an important point to make, because, if you just sort of focus on the afterlife, then you in fact, you could just do whatever you want. I mean, no one would have to worry about right or wrong at all, because all moral scales would be kind of rectified in the afterlife. And you could say, like, look, we don't even have to have any law at all, because, if someone does something wrong, they're getting punished in the afterlife. And if someone is wrong, then they'll be rewarded in the afterlife. But this is why, there's this line in Lawrence of Arabia. I think it's a great line, but, the King Prince Faisal, played by Alec Guinness, says, he's like, for Lawrence, mercy is a compassion. For me, it's merely good manners. You may decide which one is more reliable, right? Like, I think there's actually an element of, like, there's times in where a kind of ritual, almost like a ritual sense of requirement is really important, right? So the rulers or states or authorities have an obligation to create or pursue an ideal of justice, if for no other reason than that they have been told to do that by God, right? So it is the duty of the ruler or the judge or the head of a community to ensure justice amongst their flock, right? كلكم راع وكلكم مسؤول عن رعيته, right? So every one of you, even if you're a husband or a wife or a slave or a head of a family, or you all have the obligation to take care of your flock, and you will be asked on the judgment about that. So, like, whatever, especially in these instances of crisis, sometimes, rulers or prime ministers or something will just kind of write off some big chunk of people and be like, well, we can't help them, or they're on their own. But, a Muslim ruler, or a ruler who's committed to the duties given to them by God, will always try their best to achieve justice, even if, as we've said, it's impossible to attain that perfectly in the world.
Okay, we've got some questions coming through from the chat. One of them, it's an irony that many of us believe in justice at a given point in time, yet there's nowhere practice does not seem to have any intrinsic value. Does it suit those in power? How will these investigations go into the past, going to impact Muslim societies today, where Islamic law is relegated to the family courts and smaller social aspects compared to guiding economic or foreign policy? Do you think there's a focus on the ideal of justice can deter from real life justice being impacted? Amartya Sen's view. This is Professor Amartya Sen from the LSE. Question from Shafi. Pursuit of justice in this world may not always be greater public interest in many situations. You can see from the chat the various questions. So it's up to you, either Dr. Ramon or Professor Jonathan, whoever wants to answer.
Okay, well, on the one I said, I think it's to me, do you think that a focus on the ideal of justice can deter from real life justice being enacted? I mean, it could do. I don't think that's an impossible proposition. But if you don't have a standard of justice, if you don't have an ideal, it seems to me that it's hard to even know, how to even start trying to enact any justice. And I personally think that we do have common standards of justice. I talk in the book about a kind of natural law versus divine law, or they're really complementary. But I argue that there is a kind of, the Quran itself, we could say, Allah in the Quran, does say that there is a shared sense of justice that works for the believing community, the believers in the message of the Quran, but also other communities as well. And I try to demonstrate that point in various ways throughout the book. But of course, if you have revelation, there may be other things that go beyond that level of justice. Certain elements, we may say, a special guidance, that maybe people will not know, and especially some of the elements of the Sharia obviously are like that. You know, when the precise rules of inheritance were revealed, that's not something that you know, you can make up or really rationally work out. There's another question today whether, you know, how fixed are those rules given conditions, and that can be something we can discuss. But I think that fundamentally there is an ideal. Personally, I think it's an ideal that people naturally, so to speak, can peg themselves into, can understand that. And this is why you have this question that Professor Brown mentioned, that, you know, someone's given the Sharia ruling, but still somehow someone may feel that's not justice in this situation. And how can that be? And it's because of this sense we have about natural justice. So yeah, I think we need that ideal. But yeah, obviously, if everything is theory all the time, maybe you don't get to practice, and that's a problem.
Thank you. Jonathan? Jack?
I just unmute myself. You know, I think that it's interesting. You know, there's like this research on monkeys. You know, that if you go and you put like a bunch of, you know, a couple monkeys in different cages, kind of near each other, and then you know, basically each monkey like does a certain task, right? They like, you know, hit this certain thing, they get a banana, right? And then if you start giving like one of the monkeys 2 bananas, eventually the other monkeys start getting upset. Like the monkeys sense that like we're all doing the same thing, but this monkey's getting 2 bananas and we're only getting 1 banana, right? So I think there is, and what's interesting about kind of natural law in this idea of almost like a biological species law is this is actually, Muslim scholars actually talked about this, especially Mu'tazilite scholars like Abul Qasim al-Balkhi al-Ka'bi and his work. Like they would look at animals and they'd say, for example, even animals don't do incest. So animals don't have immediate family incest. And they would talk about like so they kind of felt there were notions of justice that even extended beyond human beings, that were like based in our creation as creatures of God. So I think that there, and you see this like, you know, in the Islamic legal tradition, not ever with specifically in the Quran or Hadiths or even by the companions, will be just kind of obvious to jurists that, you know, the person who has kind of been transgressive in any situation is kind of responsible for something that's wrong. So if we all know that, you know, you're supposed to hold the door for somebody when they're going in and up the balcony carrying food or a plate, and somebody doesn't hold the door, that person's done something wrong, and like they're responsible for whatever, someone dropping the food or something. Even though that's just very clearly tied to custom, there's this notion of transgression, that transgression causes wrong. On the other hand, you do see instances in human history where notions of what I think we would think of as a real natural, obvious sense of justice are not followed. And for example, I'm not an expert on this, but I've talked to people who were, but the notion of, in Pakhtunwali, in like Pashtun tribal law, that, you know, if somebody kills somebody from one family, the murderer's family has to like give one of the females from that family to the other family as a wife, right? Now the woman didn't do anything, like she's not didn't commit the crime, right? So this notion that the person who commits the crime is the one who has to pay or has to suffer or has to face consequences, that seems obvious, but actually there's some instances in human history, in fact, lots of instances, especially in the ancient world, where there was like vicarious liability, right? The person who, it might be another person who actually suffers. And so actually, like Roman law, they actually have to have a principle that says nox caput sequitur, right? Which is that the sin or the wrong goes to the head of the person who committed the crime. And Muslims have this notion clearly with the Quranic rule of la taziru waziratun wizra ukhra, right? So no bearer of burdens bears the burdens of another. But I think it's an interesting case where sometimes things that seem obvious to us and natural might not actually be that obvious to everybody or at all times.
Right, we're going to take a question from Ismail Karul. I've just unmuted you. So, Ismail, go ahead.
Yeah. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much, Professor Brown and Dr. Harvey. My question would be about the applicability of Islamic law in modern times, I mean, today. So, as well, Halak argues, the Islamic law was applied in the pre-modern states, not by the states mainly, but by individual independent judges. So, even though we understand the conception of justice in Prophet Muhammad's time, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, how do you think we can apply this conception of justice in today's nationalized nation states, which controls all spheres of legal systems? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very good question. Anyone, really? Dr. Ramon or Jack?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is it's a good question because it's one of the big questions. There is clearly a mismatch. I mean, and Halak is good at pointing this out. There's a mismatch between, you know, the Sharia as we understand it in the pre-modern age and the world situation we have now, and even within the domain of Muslim, you know, states and so on. They are nation states, and they have, you know, developed the kind of trappings and the structure of modernity, and so it becomes hard to apply things in quite the same way. At the same time, we do see that at least in some issues, you know, these fit councils and other structures that are either, you know, supranational or, you know, operating within or between states have authority in the practice of Muslims. However, they don't often have the legal authority. And we're seeing issues today about this, you know, in the responses to coronavirus. So I think it's one of these, that's a civilizational issue that we're grappling with, and no one has squared that circle, really. It seems to me, I mean, it's not an area that I, you know, am currently researching or, you know, going to have maybe Dr. Brown will have more to say on this, but my thinking is that some states, I mean, in the Muslim world, you know, basically you have to use the power of the state as the kind of governing body and try to get them to apply Islamic law in the best way, you know, in a good way, in a scholarly, rigorous way. And I think some people are trying to do that effort. And also it's important that things continue in a sort of organic way as well, in the hope that possibly times will change and there will be the possibility to not have to rely on national governments in order to do, you know, do good and to apply law, but we just don't know what that looks like yet. So it's an ongoing query and research program. So I have no easy answer on that one.
I mean, I just don't agree with the Halak's argument at all. I mean, I think that, look, Saudi Arabia has a Sharia judiciary. Iran has a Sharia judiciary. Like other Muslim countries have significant portions of their national or state laws within federations are applications of Sharia. And these, I mean, somebody might not like, oh, this law in Saudi Arabia I don't like, or I don't like that law in Iran. But I mean, these are functioning legal systems that provide justice for their people. And I mean, whether or not somebody likes one law or another is really just a kind of arbitrary, right? And in addition, I mean, you can, this notion that kind of the judge is sort of applying this flexible system and giving justice in every instance, and then that gets, you know, reified or fossilized by the intrusion of the state. That's just not accurate, because Islamic law, as you can see this coming from the 1300s, especially during the Ottoman period, much more state involvement, much more government involvement in fixing the options that judges have. In addition to which, by the way, Muslim scholars are quite insistent that judges rule by the main opinion of their madhab, right? Because otherwise, you don't have predictable law. And in addition, we have, if the Ottoman Empire continued to exist, for example, we would have you know, in the Ottoman Empire, its legal reforms in the 1870s and 1880s, it has a 100% Sharia legitimate judiciary that is applying like codified modern Islamic law that looks just like French law or looks just like English law at the time, but just, you know, Muslim rules. None of the people involved in those Ottoman legal reforms, at least up until 1909, ever thought that they were like secularizing or being non-Muslim, right? They were just using the legal technology of their day to create Sharia, to kind of format the Sharia in a way that was better functioning for modern states, right? Finally, I would just say that yes, like the nation state, the modern nation state is this pervasive, invasive, all-controlling entity, you know, Leviathan. But whether or not you like that or not is nothing to do with whether you're Muslim or whether you believe in Islamic law. There's lots of Americans who don't believe the government should be involved in telling us where we can build our duck ponds or what we should be teaching our kids in school. And so, you know, that's really not a question of Sharia or not Sharia. That's a question of whether you think the state should be involved in all aspects of your life. And I think the answer for me is no. But that's a debate that is completely separate from Islamic law or not Islamic law.
We've got a lot of questions. As you can see, it's a very popular topic and it's a very contentious one as well. So really either yourself or Dr. Ramon, you can pick whichever questions you want. Really, it's up to you. Jack, does anyone any question that you think?
I see a question on appointments of judges by Aisha Sayed. So, I mean, Islamic civilization is a big place, long period of time, big geographical expanse, right? But in general, the judge appointments come from the ruler, right? The ruler makes judge appointments. And definitely there's the same kind of, there's always politics, whether they're kind of, you know, petty politics of like, I'm going to give a job to this guy and not that guy, or I'm going to hook up my nephew or not my nephew, right? And I think that the politicization, this kind of politicization is inevitable. And if it seems kind of overwhelming or sort of dramatic and unjust today, it's just because we live in society where, you know, the tremendous rate of cultural change or technological change over the last couple of decades, not to mention the last 200 years, means that, you know, every core areas and core issues of life are being debated with absolutely nothing even resembling a consensus. So yeah, things are going to be politicized, and that's just inevitable.
Thank you. Ismail, you had another question again. Sorry, not quite. Follow-up. Very quick.
I just wanted to follow up on Professor Brown's answer, but another person asked the question, so that's good. That's okay.
That's fine. Okay, thank you. Dr. Ramon, you were going to say something.
I was going to say there's been a couple of questions kind of on a more theological element level of, you know, the Ash'aris and the Mu'tazilis. I put it quite clearly in the book and also in kind of subsequent research that I'm doing and various things. So I'm trying to work more from the Maturidi perspective, which is kind of a third option between those two. So, you know, famously, the Mu'tazila look at justice as being something kind of, you could say, rationally appreciable from the mind, in a sense, you know, they kind of, in a sense, see it in the structure of the universe, perhaps, and put it outside of God in that sense. The Ash'aris famously look for a divine command theory. Of course, there's nuances and subtleties in both of those positions. The Maturidis try to place that, well, sometimes they're placed as midway or sometimes put as being close to the Mu'tazila. I think that theologically they do have an interesting way of trying to resolve some of these questions, and particularly important is the kind of divine attribute of wisdom. But to get into that here is probably not very profitable. But I've written some things on that. Some things are in the book. Some more is coming in a forthcoming book. and just generally, I've got some things on this, so you can look out for those. But I think there is an importance to having that theological conversation, and obviously, you know, on the intellectual level, it's not going to maybe solve some of the practical issues, but to be able to try to ground our discourses in a coherent way, and be able to, you know, ultimately kind of interrogate those higher order questions about, well, how exactly do you think this justice manifests? Where does it come from? You know, how does that relate to our understanding of the nature of God and so on? So, you know, I would just like to point out there's a third option in there, and there's other options, of course, as well. I mean, it's a, you know, Islamic thought is quite vast, and so you know, even within schools, there's often various opinions. But yeah, I think it's important to point that out, and you know, refer to writings to get more information on that.
Fantastic. Okay, so we're coming towards the end. We've only got a few minutes left. Can I request both of our speakers to just sum up in a minute or so, you know, just reflections on the topic. So can I just start off with Dr. Ramon very quickly, and then Jack? Besides purchasing your book.
No, I mean, I've actually not been promoting it as heavily as you have, Mizam, but I do suggest that it's hopefully a benefit, and you know, it's Ramadan coming, so you know, it may be a good time to read something on the Quran. But alhamdulillah, I mean, I think that you know, it's really interesting for me. A lot of us, obviously, the reason we're doing this is because we're generally in lockdown. We're in our homes, you know, and we're there with our family members. And so this point that Dr. Brown made about every person being a shepherd, I mean, you know, we've got to try to manage justice in our own households and in our own smaller communities ultimately. And on a personal, ethical level, I think, you know, we need to reflect on our own injustices. You know, and if, you know, that's really where change will come, you know, is as much from being able to bring justice into our own dealings and into our own households, into our own life. And of course, you know, we get guidance on that from the Quran, from the Sunnah, from scholarly work and so on. But also there is just such an important element of, you know, cultivating our own qualities to be able to be just in the moment, in the situation. And so it's not always about going to a judge. I mean, that's actually that's the kind of bottom line. The very last resort is like somehow to go to a judge or go to court. But as everyone knows, the reality for almost everything is that we have to sort it out on an ethical level as human beings. So I think it's about developing, I would say it's about developing a very practical, in the moment and contextual sense. You know, really it's about the virtue of justice. If you wanted to go into a kind of virtue ethics. So yeah, I mean, I think that's something we have to do in practice, and of course there's room to reflect and write on it as well as, you know, scholars. So that would be my summing up.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ramon. Thank you. And reminder anyone, you can purchase his book. You can go to Amazon or Edinburgh Press. Very important. Please do purchase. We need to support our Muslim academics and their publications. Thank you. Dr. Brown.
Islamic.
Yeah, I guess I would just kind of say that you know, this situation really, you know, I think one of the main obstacles that kind of modern Western society has in answering a lot of these questions, and Muslims fall victim to this in the West, is that, you know, we have this tremendous arrogance about you know, the kind of end of history and the certainty of the present. And when something like this virus happens, you know, you realize like a lot of that stuff is just hooey, right? I mean, death is always around the corner. It always was around the corner. And, you know, suddenly people start thinking like about a lot more basic stuff than they did before. And, you know, you end up like, you know, I almost never talk to my neighbors normally. Now I see them all the time. And, you know, you end up realizing like, hey, like maybe, you know, I can't just get all self-righteous and yelling at people and, you know, this, that, and the other, this is my right, that's my right. But that, you know, you have to kind of have, like kind of come to harmonious relationship with people, and that harmony and and the ability to coexist is like so valuable. It's so valuable. And that's, you know, this notion of the Sharia as like restorative justice, the Sharia, and Halak does talk about this, right? That the Sharia's objective is to get things back to a state of peace, you know, to a state of harmony. Like that's a very valuable thing. And that's what I've been thinking about.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Brown. And inshallah, we hope to see you in the UK or wherever you're going to be, but you could pass by through Europe. Maybe once your new book is ready, we'll have yourself and Dr. Ramon maybe do a one-day course on the subject. It's a very popular.
I would love it.
Yeah, and maybe we'll hold it at the Royal Courts of Justice in London. How about
Inshallah, I hope we are
Thanks.
able to travel again and see each other.
Inshallah, inshallah. Thank you so much once again.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody.
Everyone. Take care.
Yeah, Ramadan Kareem.
Assalamu alaikum. Thanks for coming in. Allah bless you all. Alhamdulillah.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.